The Cuban Missile Crisis lasted 13 days. During that time, the people of the United States felt as they had never before been so vulnerable to nuclear weapons. President John F. Kennedy faced a delicate series of negotiations and communications with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev to try to lead our country out of danger. Here is what led up to the crisis and how the crisis was handled by President Kennedy. In 1959, Fidel Castro took over the Caribbean nation of Cuba. Over time, he became dependent on the Soviet Union for military and economic aid. He aligned himself with Soviet leader Khrushchev and became their ally in the Cold War against the United States. It was on October 14, 1962, that an American U-2 spy plane discovered Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles being assembled in Cuba. The plane photographed the missiles, and this began the Cuban Missile Crisis. These missiles were a huge threat to the United States because they were just 90 miles from Florida. The entire eastern U.S. was in real threat of a nuclear attack. President Kennedy made a televised broadcast on October 16, 1962, to inform the United States public of this threat. He had a plan to form a blockade of warships to prevent more missiles from being delivered. He also made it clear to the Soviets that they were to remove the existing missiles. The Soviets argued that the U.S. missiles in Turkey were an imminent threat to the Soviet Union, and the missiles on Cuba were to even the score. Americans did not want a nuclear war and rallied for peace. They also began storing up gasoline as well as food supplies in case the worst was to happen. The Soviet ships did not pass the blockade of U.S. ships, and negotiations continued between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Finally, a twofold negotiation ended the crisis. First, the U.S. pledged not to invade Cuba, and the Soviets pledged to remove their missiles from Cuba. Many years later, it was found that an additional part of the agreement was that the U.S. would remove the missiles it had in Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought attention to the vulnerability of nations to nuclear war. It was the first step towards a nuclear test ban treaty. It also resulted in direct hotlines between the White House and the Kremlin to prevent future miscommunications between the two nations.